The gun pressed cold against her temple was the least frightening thing in the room. What terrified Beatrice Eldon more was the look on Sheriff Kane Daltrey's face. Not the hard, calculated expression of a lawman doing his job, but something raw and desperate, the face of a man who had already decided what he was willing to lose. His jaw was set like granite, his gray eyes fixed on the man holding the weapon, and in that single frozen moment between heartbeats, Beatrice understood that he was about to do something reckless, something that might get him killed. "Let her go, Harlan," Kane said, his voice low and stripped of everything except absolute certainty. The man behind her, Harlan Voss, with his whiskey-sour breath and his cruelty worn as casually as his hat, laughed. It was the kind of laugh that had never touched anything warm. "Sheriff," Harlan said, drawing out the word like it tasted sweet, "this woman doesn't belong here. I think we both know that. She never did. And you standing there like she's worth something, it's almost embarrassing." The saloon had gone absolutely silent. 20 men, maybe more, and not one of them breathed. Beatrice could feel the barrel trembling slightly against her skin. Not from her fear, from Harlan's excitement. That was the more dangerous kind of trembling. "You belong right here," Kane said, and for a single disorienting second, Beatrice thought he was talking to Harlan. Then she realized his eyes had moved to her and only to her, and the words landed differently. Completely differently. Not a statement of geography. A declaration. "You belong right here, B. Don't let him tell you otherwise." She had been told many things since arriving in Caldwell, Kansas in the spring of 1882. She had been told she was too educated for the West, too Eastern, too soft, too strange. She had been told by 3 different men in 3 different weeks that a woman traveling alone was asking for trouble. She had been told by the woman who ran the boarding house that no respectable female stayed past a season. She had been told, in ways both quiet and loud, in ways that cut and ways that simply wore her down like water on stone, that this place was not hers and never would be. But she had not expected to hear it with a gun at her head, and she had not expected that the one man who would finally say the opposite would be the same man she had spent 6 weeks actively trying to despise. It had started, as most things in Caldwell did that year, with dust and with trouble, and with a letter she should never have opened. Beatrice Eldon had arrived in Caldwell on the 14th of April, 1882, on the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railroad, stepping off the train with a single leather trunk, a small carpet bag, and the kind of composure that takes years of practice to assemble. She was 26 years old, dark-haired, with the sort of face that people sometimes called interesting when they meant to say something else entirely. She had spent the last 4 years in Boston working as a telegraph operator, and before that in Cincinnati doing the same, and she was, by most measurable accounts, extraordinarily good at her job. She had come to Caldwell for a position. The Western Union office in the town had lost its operator to a rattlesnake in February, a fact communicated to the company's eastern offices with considerable urgency, and Beatrice had applied. She had been the most qualified candidate. She had also, she would later learn, been the only candidate willing to relocate to a cattle town on the southern edge of Kansas, a place that sat right at the mouth of the Kishome Trail, and received, in the driving season, more Texas cowboys than any sensible person could manage. The station agent at Caldwell had looked at her for a long moment when she arrived, taking in her gray traveling dress and her Boston address on the paperwork, and had said, with the particular brand of helpfulness that is actually the opposite, "Madam, I think there may have been some confusion." There had not been any confusion. She had walked to the telegraph office on Main Street, presented her credentials to the postmaster, a wide man named Gerald Finch, who seemed to be perpetually slightly damp, and had been shown to her station with a mixture of bewilderment and reluctant respect. The equipment was good, a Morse key and sounder of the standard type, well maintained by whoever had used it last. The chair was uncomfortable. The window faced the street, which meant she could see everything that happened in Caldwell, Kansas, whether she wanted to or not. And in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, there was quite a lot happening. The town sat at a volatile intersection. The cattle drives coming up from Texas brought money and disorder in equal measure. The railroad brought commerce and the particular kind of men who followed commerce. The proximity to Indian territory to the south brought a complicated and often painful web of politics, broken treaties, and human suffering that Beatrice, who had read Frederick Olmsted and had opinions, found difficult to witness without feeling the full weight of it. And underneath all of it ran a current of something else, something she would come to understand only gradually, a struggle for control of the town itself between the men who wanted law and order and the men who profited from the absence of both. Sheriff Kane Daltrey had been the law in Caldwell for 2 years when Beatrice arrived. She had seen him on her first day, walking the length of Main Street with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going and was not concerned about who noticed. He was tall, with dark hair that had gone slightly too long at the collar, and a face that had been weathered by something more than just sun. He wore his badge the way some men wore their faith, not as an ornament but as a weight, something that cost something to carry. She had not thought about him particularly that first day. She had been too busy arguing with Gerald Finch about the hours she would be expected to keep. The previous operator worked 7 days, Finch said. The previous operator is dead, Beatrice replied, not unkindly but with complete precision. I will work 6. I will require Sundays free. Finch had looked at her over the top of his spectacles with the expression of a man confronting something he had no category for, and he had agreed. The first week passed in a blur of messages. Cattle prices, shipping schedules, weather reports, communications between ranchers and buyers and lawyers. Beatrice was fast. She was accurate. She had a memory for code that bordered on the remarkable, and within 3 days she had established a rhythm in the Caldwell office that it had apparently never had before. Messages went out cleanly. Messages came in and were recorded without error. The small pile of uncategorized and unsent communications she had found on her predecessor's desk had been sorted and dispatched by Wednesday. It was Gerald Finch who first said it to her directly, though she had been hearing it in other forms since she stepped off the train. "Miss Eldon," he said, on her 6th day, setting down his coffee cup with the careful deliberateness of a man about to say something he knew was going to cost him. "I want you to understand that I mean this in the spirit of genuine concern." "Then say it plainly," she said, not looking up from the message she was transcribing. "This is not a place that suits a woman of your background, your education. The people here are capable of receiving telegraph communications like anyone else," she said. "Rough," Finch finished. "And I worry that you will find it challenging," she offered. "Stimulating, worthy of my attention," Finch sighed. "I worry you will find it dangerous, and I worry that when you do, it will be too late for a clean exit." She had looked up at him then, and she had seen that he was not being condescending. He was genuinely worried. She softened just slightly. "Mr. Finch," she said, "I have worked in Cincinnati and Boston and in 2 cities in between. I have had telegrams threatened, equipment destroyed, and on one occasion I had a gun drawn on me by a man who did not want his wife to receive a particular communication. I am aware of what difficult looks like." Finch had nodded slowly, but his expression had not changed. "All the same," he said, "this is different." She had not understood then what he meant. She would. It was on her 9th day in Caldwell that she first actually spoke to Kane Daltrey, and it was not an auspicious beginning. She was coming out of the dry goods store on 2nd Street with a small parcel, soap, needles, a pound of coffee that the woman who ran the boarding house charged too much for, when a horse went sideways in the street, spooked by something she could not immediately identify, and knocked into her from behind with enough force to send her parcel and her composure both into the mud. She was picking herself up, jaw tight, examining the damage to her dress with the resigned expression of someone adding this to a long mental list of grievances, when she heard Boots stop beside her. "Are you hurt?" She glanced up. The sheriff, standing there with the horse's reins in hand, having apparently materialized from wherever he had been when the animal went sideways. "I am not," she said, reaching for her parcel. He picked it up first, handed it to her, looked at her with those gray eyes that seemed to be doing a great deal of quiet calculation. "You're the new telegraph operator," he said. "Beatrice Eldon," she said, and offered her hand in the way she had learned men respected more than a curtsy. Directly, no hesitation. He shook it. "Kane Daltrey, are you sure you're not hurt? You went down hard." "I am quite sure. Thank you for retrieving my parcel." She had walked away, and she had been proud of herself for exactly the right amount of time, about 4 steps, before she registered that her wrist was aching and had been since she hit the ground. She did not, however, go back. She told herself it was because she did not need his help. Later, she would recognize it was because she had not liked the way he looked at her. Not offensively, not with any of the expressions she had learned to identify and deflect, but with a kind of direct assessment that she found oddly uncomfortable, as if he was someone who might, given sufficient opportunity, actually see her clearly. The 2nd week brought the letter. It arrived in the regular mail satchel, addressed to a woman named Charlotte Voss, care of the Caldwell post office. Beatrice sorted mail as part of her duties, and she set it aside for pickup without thinking much about it. But Charlotte Voss did not come to collect it, and a week later, when the mail satchel came again, there was another letter, same handwriting, same address. And this one had been opened and resealed badly, the kind of sloppy resealing that someone does when they want you to know they've been inside. She flagged it for Finch, who turned a shade paler than his usual pale. "Leave it," he said. "It's been tampered with," she said. "I know," he said. "Leave it." She had left it. But she had also, in the way that she did things, quietly, methodically, without announcing her intentions, begun paying more attention to what moved through the Caldwell telegraph office that might be better described as information than communication. There was a pattern. She began to see it in the 3rd week. Messages about cattle shipments that, when cross-referenced with what she knew of the actual drives coming up the Kishome, did not entirely add up. Timestamps that implied messages had been sent before they logically could have been. A particular string of coded language, not Morse, but within Morse, a secondary layer that she recognized because she had seen something similar once in Cincinnati, used by a numbers operation that had eventually been shut down. She was not a detective. She was a telegraph operator. But she had a mind that organized information, the way a river organizes water, naturally and without effort. And what the information was organizing itself into was not comfortable. She was still working through it on the Thursday of her 3rd week when the door to the telegraph office opened and Sheriff Kane Daltrey walked in. "Miss Eldon," he said, closing the door behind him. He was not in a hurry. He sat down in the single visitor's chair across from her station as if he had an appointment, which he did not. "Sheriff," she said, continuing to transcribe the message she was working on because the message did not pause for visitors. He waited. She respected that, the waiting. Most men filled silence badly. When she was done, she put down her pencil and looked at him. "What can I do for you?" she asked. He looked at her with that same quiet calculation she had seen in the street. "I think," he said carefully, "that you've been noticing something." She kept her expression entirely neutral. "I notice a great many things. It's part of the work." "I think you've been noticing something specific," he said. "Something that involves a man named Harlan Voss." The name landed between them like a stone in still water. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The letters for Charlotte Voss." "His wife," Kane said. "She's been trying to reach a lawyer in Wichita. Harlan intercepts everything that comes and goes through this office, or he has been, before you arrived." Beatrice absorbed this. He had access to this office. "He had access to the man who ran this office," Kane said simply. "Money is access, in my experience." She thought about Gerald Finch and his pallor and his careful instruction to leave the letters alone. "I see," she said. "What else have you seen?" Kane asked. Not a demand. A question that acknowledged she might have seen quite a lot. She studied him. He was perhaps 30, 31. The kind of age where a man either knew himself or was still becoming someone. He had the look of the latter, not finished, not fully settled, but moving in a specific direction with complete conviction. "The cattle shipment codes," she said. "Someone's been running a shadow communication system through this office, probably for the better part of a year." Kane nodded slowly. "Harlan Voss operates the largest stock operation between here and the Texas border. He's also been stealing cattle for 3 years, rebranding them, and running them north on drives that look legitimate on paper." "And the papers," Beatrice said, understanding now spreading through her like water through dry ground, "get telegraphed." "Through here," Kane said. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "And you're telling me this because—" "Because whoever runs this office is either part of it or a target," he said. "And you're clearly not part of it." "How do you know that clearly?" she asked. "Because you haven't been here long enough," he said. "And because if you were part of it, you wouldn't have flagged the tampered letter with Finch." She had not realized he knew about that. She revised her assessment of how much he watched. "What is it you need from me?" she asked. He leaned forward slightly. "I need you to keep doing your job exactly as you've been doing it. Don't change anything. Don't do anything differently. But if you see something come through, something that looks like a shipment code, a false timestamp, anything that doesn't add up, I need you to make a note of it." "You're asking me to report to you," she said. "I'm asking you to keep your eyes open," he said. "Which you're already doing. I'm just asking you to tell me what you see." She thought about Finch and his careful pallor. She thought about Charlotte Voss and the letters she could not receive. She thought about the pattern in the codes, the way the information had organized itself in her mind without being asked. "All right," she said. He stood, picking up his hat from his knee. "Thank you, Miss Eldon." "Beatrice," she said, which surprised her slightly. She did not usually offer her first name to men she had spoken to exactly twice. He paused at the door. Something moved in his expression, not quite a smile but the precursor to one, something that had the same warmth without the performance. "Beatrice," he said, and left. She sat for a moment after the door closed, her hand resting on the Morse key, and noticed with some irritation that her heartbeat had changed tempo. The weeks that followed were strange. Strange in the particular way that danger is when it has not yet arrived, but you can feel it coming. Not frightening, exactly, but heightened. Colors seemed sharper. Sounds carried farther. The ordinary business of her days, messages transmitted and received, the rhythm of the key, the The smell of hot coffee from the pot she kept on the small stove took on an additional quality. Everything was also something else. Kane came to the office 3 times in that period, and each time they talked for longer. Not always about Voss, sometimes about other things, the way that happened when 2 people started out with a professional relationship and found, almost accidentally, that they had more than that to say to each other. He told her about how he had come to Caldwell. From Missouri originally, he had worked as a deputy in Dodge City before that. And before that, he had spent 3 years doing something he was elliptical about that she gathered involved the aftermath of the war in ways that were not pleasant. He did not tell her these things all at once. They came out in fragments, in the interstices of practical conversation, the way that real self-disclosure happens, sideways, not directly when the guard is down. She told him about Boston, about the telegraph office there, the way the city moved through the wire, thousands of voices translated into dots and dashes and back again. About her mother, who had died when Beatrice was 20 and had been, her whole life, the kind of woman who believed that competence was the most important thing a person could carry, and had transmitted this belief to her daughter with the precision of a telegraph signal, cleanly, completely, without static. She sounds remarkable, Kane said on the 3rd visit. She was practical, Beatrice said, which is the same thing sometimes. He looked at her with those quiet eyes. You're like her, he said, not a compliment exactly. A statement of fact, offered with the particular respect of someone who knew what they were saying. She felt something shift. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of shift you saw in novels, where everything changed in a flash of lightning and sudden clarity. It was the kind of shift that happens in real things, quiet, structural, deep. Like something that had been slightly wrong was adjusting itself into the correct position. She did not say anything about it. She was, as Kane had noted, practical. It was the 6th week when things began to move faster. She received a message on a Tuesday morning. A cattle shipment code she now recognized immediately. A false timestamp embedded in what appeared to be a routine inquiry from a buyer in Abilene. She made her note, as she had been doing. But this one was different. This one contained something she had not seen before. A name. Not encoded, not hidden, sitting plain in the middle of the message like an error or a warning, Charlotte. She stared at it for a long time. Then she locked the office, something she had never done during working hours, and walked directly to the sheriff's office 3 blocks south. Kane was at his desk with his deputy, a younger man named Sam Pryor, who had the eager, anxious energy of someone who wanted very much to prove himself and was not entirely sure how. She put the transcribed message on his desk without preamble. He read it. His expression changed, not dramatically, but the quality of his stillness changed, the way still water changes quality when something is moving beneath it. How long ago did this come in? He said. 20 minutes. He stood. Sam, he said, go to the Voss ranch, quietly. Don't ride up, don't announce yourself. Get close enough to see whether Charlotte Voss is there. Sam was out the door in under a minute. Kane looked at Beatrice. Where are you staying? The Everett boarding house, she said. Don't go back there tonight, he said. Not until I know what this means. She felt the first genuine thread of alarm, clean and cold. You think she's in danger? I think Harlan Voss is not a patient man, Kane said, and I think he has known for some time that Charlotte has been trying to contact a lawyer. This, he touched the transcribed message, looks like a warning. A message to someone that she's been located. Located, Beatrice repeated. She left him. 3 weeks ago. We didn't tell anyone she'd come to town because the moment Harlan knows she's here, Beatrice said. In Caldwell, Kane met her eyes, "At the Everett boarding house," he said. "She arrived 4 days after you did." The world reorganized itself very slightly. Beatrice thought about the other woman at the boarding house, quiet, dark-eyed, cautious in the specific way that women were cautious when they had learned that caution was a survival skill rather than a personality trait. Charlotte. She had told Beatrice her name was Clara. "I know her," Beatrice said. "I know you do," Kane said. "And so does Harlan now because someone," he paused, and there was something bleak in his eyes for a moment, "someone told him." "Finch," Beatrice said. "I think so," Kane said. Yes, she absorbed this, the careful pallor. The instruction to leave the letters alone, the access. "Then we don't have much time," she said. "No," Kane said. He was already pulling on his coat. "Go to the church on Maple Street. Tell Pastor Harrington I sent you. Stay there until I come for you." "I'm not going to wait in a church while, Beatrice." He said her name in a way that stopped her, and there was nothing commanding in it. It was the way you said a name when you were frightened for someone. "Please." She looked at him. He was looking at her with those gray eyes, and something in them was absolutely transparent, stripped of all the careful distance he usually maintained. And she recognized what she was seeing the way you recognized a language you knew, even when someone else was speaking it. He was frightened. For her specifically. "All right," she said, quietly. She went to the church. She was on her feet before Sam finished the sentence. "Miss Eldon," Sam said, stepping into her path. "The sheriff specifically said—" "I heard what he said," she said. "Stand aside, Mr. Pryor." Sam was young and willing, but he was not willing enough to physically stop her, and she walked past him into the street. The Silver Dollar was the largest saloon in Caldwell, 3 blocks north, and the sound coming from it as she approached was the particular sound of held breath. A crowd that was present and silent in the way that crowds were silent when something dangerous was happening. She pushed through the door. Kane was in the center of the room. Harlan Voss was to her left, and he had Charlotte, who was 32 years old with eyes like river water and bruises old enough to have yellowed at the edges, in one arm, and in his other hand was a pistol. He was a large man, Harlan Voss, the kind of large that had never been tested enough to teach it humility, and he looked at Beatrice as she entered with an expression of cold theatrical amusement. "Well," he said, "the telegraph lady." That was when it happened. The moment she had started from, the moment she had arrived at the story's beginning. The gun moved from Charlotte to her, faster than she had time to process, and Harlan pulled her in front of him with a grip that felt like a trap closing, and the barrel pressed cold against her temple, and the room went absolutely silent. "Let her go, Harlan," Kane said. "This woman doesn't belong here," Harlan said. "She never did." And Kane looked at her, only at her, and said, "You belong right here." And she believed him. That was the remarkable thing. In that moment, with Harlan Voss's gun at her head and 20 witnesses, and 6 years of being told in various registers that she was in the wrong place, she believed him absolutely. Then things happened very quickly. She had been told, in a self-defense course in Boston that her mother had insisted on with characteristic practicality, that the most important thing to remember if someone put a gun to your head was that the gun was a distraction, and the arm holding you was the actual problem. She had thought about it as an abstract fact for 6 years. She thought about it now very concretely. She shifted her weight, all of it, suddenly, downward and to the left. Harlan, who had not expected this, who had clearly expected that she would remain still and frightened and useful to him, was caught completely unprepared. His arm loosened by reflex. She pulled free. The gun went off. The sound in the confined space was enormous. She felt the air move. The bullet went into the ceiling. And then Kane was already moving, crossing the distance in 3 strides that seemed impossibly fast for a man his size. And his hand was on Harlan's gun arm, and the gun was on the floor in Harlan Voss, who had terrorized the southern edge of Kansas for 3 years, who had stolen cattle and intercepted letters, and ruled through the particular combination of money and fear that powerful, cruel men have always used, went down to his knees and stayed there. The 6 men Harlan had ridden in with stood very still. Sam Pryor appeared in the doorway with 2 other deputies Beatrice had not met, and the mathematics of the situation reorganized themselves in a direction that was no longer favorable to Harlan's associates. Charlotte sat down on the nearest chair. She was shaking, but she was upright, and she looked at Beatrice with an expression that was somewhere between relief and something fiercer. The look of a woman who has survived something long and hard and is only now permitting herself to understand that she has come out the other side. Beatrice went to her, sat beside her, took her hand. The room breathed again. Kane stood over Harlan Voss with the stillness of someone who has spent considerable time learning how not to do more than is necessary. He looked at the 6 men. "Anyone who wants to leave Caldwell in the next 5 minutes without being charged with anything," he said, "should start moving." They moved. Harlan was taken to the jail, which was small and occupied the back half of the sheriff's office and smelled of dust and old coffee and the particular stubborn smell of incarceration. Sam Pryor locked the door with an expression of profound satisfaction. The charges, cattle theft, fraud, assault, the interrupted communications, were extensive, and Kane had been building them quietly for 2 years, and the case, when it came to trial in Wichita 3 months later, was airtight. But that was later. That night, Caldwell settled itself after the manner of frontier towns, which was not peacefully, but at least without further immediate crisis. Beatrice sat in the sheriff's office long after Sam and the other deputies had gone, in the same visitor's chair she had sat in before, and she was very deliberately not thinking about how close the bullet had come, and not thinking about the expression on Kane Daltrey's face in the moment before it happened, and not thinking about the 4 words he had said that were still reverberating in her chest like a bell that had been struck and had not yet finished sounding. Kane came in from the back, from checking on Harlan in the cell, presumably, and stopped when he saw her. "You were supposed to stay at the church," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. The lamp on his desk threw warm light across the room, and she could see him very clearly, more clearly than she usually permitted herself to see things that she was trying not to think about. There was a cut on his jaw from something, Harlan's elbow, she thought, in the struggle, and he looked tired in the specific way that people looked when the thing they had been bracing for had finally arrived and been survived. "You could have been killed," he said. "You could have been killed," she said. "You were in that room first." He sat down heavily in his own chair and looked at her across the desk with an expression that was completely open, completely without defense, and she recognized it because she had been wearing something like it for weeks and suppressing it with considerable effort. "Beatrice," he said. "Don't," she said quickly, and then stopped, because she was not entirely sure what she was telling him not to do, not to say it, not to look at her like that, not to be someone she was developing a complicated and inconvenient set of feelings about. He waited. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, with the precision that was her mother's gift to her, "I have been told since I arrived here that I do not belong, by Finch, by the men at the cattle exchange who looked at me in the post office and looked away, by the woman who sold me thread on my 3rd day and told me, very kindly, that it was difficult for women like me here. I have been told in many ways and many times, and I made the choice not to care about it because I am good at my job and I was here to do it. Kane said nothing, listening. "But it is one thing," she said more quietly, "not to care about it. It is another thing to have someone say the opposite." She paused. "You meant it?" "Yes," he said. "In that room," she said, "with that man's gun at my head, you looked at me and you said I belong here." "I did," he said. "Did you mean Caldwell?" she asked. "Or did you mean something else?" The question was direct, and it landed between them directly, and she watched him with the full attention she usually reserved for the more complex transmission signals, reading every nuance, every microsecond of expression. He held her gaze steadily, and then he said, "I meant something else." The space between them changed. She felt it, a release of pressure, like weather clearing, like a signal coming through clean after a long stretch of static. "I have been trying," she said, "quite hard not to have feelings about you." "I know," he said. "I've been doing the same thing." "It hasn't worked," she said. "No," he agreed. "It hasn't." She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back. And then, because she was a woman who was practical in the deepest sense of the word, and because she was also, despite all her efforts, a woman who was very much in the grip of something she had no interest in talking herself out of anymore, she said, "What do we do about it?" He stood up from his desk, and he walked around it, and he sat in the chair beside her rather than across from her, and the shift in geography between them was small and significant and absolutely intentional. "I think," he said, "that we take it slowly, because you're worth that. And I have not always made the best decisions where things that matter to me are concerned, and I would rather do this right than fast." She absorbed this. It was the right answer. It was also, she recognized, the answer of a man who had been hurt before, who had learned caution the way people learned it, through the specific education of loss. "All right," she said, slowly. He smiled then, fully, the smile that she had been seeing the precursor to for weeks, and it was something. She registered it somewhere well below the level of analysis. "Good," he said. She stood, picking up her bag. At the door she paused. "For what it's worth," she said without turning around, "I think you belong here too, not in Caldwell. Here." She turned just enough to look at him over her shoulder. "In this conversation." He said nothing, but she saw it, the color in his face, the genuine caught-off-guard quality of it, the expression of a man who had not expected to be met quite so directly and was discovering that he appreciated it enormously. She went back to the boarding house. She did not sleep for some time. The weeks that followed were different from the first 6. The fundamental quality of being in Caldwell changed for Beatrice. Not because the town changed. It remained, as it had always been, a complicated and demanding place full of dust and commerce, and the particular human drama of a frontier settlement navigating its own becoming, but because her place in it solidified. The news of what had happened in the Silver Dollar traveled the way news traveled in small towns, which was comprehensively and quickly. People understood, in the way that people understood things without being told explicitly, that the telegraph operator had stood firm in a dangerous moment, that she had pulled herself free when Harlan Voss had grabbed her, that she had walked into a saloon gunfight when she had been told to stay in a church. There was a recalibration. Not everyone approved, some people never approved, but the dismissal, the automatic assumption that she was provisional and temporary and essentially beside the point, that began to change. The woman who sold thread told her, 2 days after, that she was welcome to stay as long as she liked. Gerald Finch resigned from the postmaster's office. His replacement was a narrow, precise man named Arthur Cole, who had impeccable communication ethics and no arrangement with anyone. Beatrice found him a significant improvement. Charlotte Voss, who was now Charlotte again, fully, because the person she had been afraid to be had come back to her, the moment Harlan was behind bars, remained in Caldwell through the summer. The lawyer in Wichita had received the letters after all, Beatrice learned, because the lawyer had come to Caldwell in person, a small, fierce woman named Margaret Hensley, who filed Charlotte's petition for divorce with a speed and efficiency that Beatrice respected profoundly. She and Charlotte became genuine friends, the kind of friendship that forms between women who have experienced parallel difficulties and recognized each other. They took meals together, walked together in the evenings when the heat of the day had finally released its grip, talked about things both serious and ordinary with the ease of people who had established trust through something real. Charlotte was, Beatrice noticed, watching the development between her and Kane with a quiet satisfaction that she rarely commented on, but occasionally let show around the edges. "He's a good man," Charlotte said one evening in late May, the two of them sitting on the boarding house porch with lemonade. "Yes," Beatrice said. "A genuinely good man," Charlotte said, with an emphasis that had weight behind it, the emphasis of someone who had recently had occasion to understand what the absence of that quality looked like. "I know," Beatrice said. Charlotte looked at her. And we are taking it slowly," Beatrice said. "Slowly," Charlotte repeated in a tone of mild theatrical exasperation. "It is sensible," Beatrice said. "Sensible," Charlotte said, "is extremely boring to observe from the outside." Beatrice laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came easily now, more easily than it had in the first weeks, and she noticed that about herself, how laughter had become less effortful, how the specific tension of feeling like she was somewhere provisional had gradually loosened its grip on her chest. She was, she realized, happy. Not broadly, not in the uncomplicated way that happiness was described in the kind of books she had read when she was young, but the specific, textured, real happiness of someone who has found a place and a work and a person that felt genuinely right. The slowly, as it turned out, meant something particular in practice. Kane came to the telegraph office every few days, sometimes with specific purpose, and sometimes, increasingly, without one. He would sit in the visitor's chair and she would work, and they would talk in the intervals between transmissions. And the conversations ranged from the immediate to the abstract, in the way of conversations between people who are genuinely curious about each other's interior worlds. He told her about his family, a sister in Missouri, a father who had died in the war when Kane was 14, a childhood that had been marked by the particular uncertainty of that era. He told her about why he had become a lawman, which was not a glamorous story but an honest one. He had been in a town where something violent and wrong had happened, and there had been no one in a position to prevent it, and he had decided, at 22, that he would rather be someone who stood in the gap. She told him about the time she had memorized the entire Morse code key in a single night because her instructor had told her it would take a week. About the messages she remembered, the beautiful ones, the terrible ones, the mundane ones that turned out to be the most human. About the birth of her nephew in Cincinnati via telegraph, her sister-in-law's husband transmitting the news with such enthusiasm that he made 3 errors in the message. One evening in late June, he asked if she would walk with him, and she said yes, and they walked south along the edge of town to where the buildings thinned and the Kansas sky opened up above them, enormous and absolute, the kind of sky that was genuinely hard to look at for its sheer scale. They stood there for a while without speaking. The cattle sounds from the pens at the south end of town drifted up to them. Somewhere a dog was barking with the rhythmic persistence of a dog that has forgotten why it started. "I owe you something," Kane said. She looked at him. "I told you that you belonged here," he said. "In the saloon, I meant it. but I want to say it properly without a gun in the room when you actually have the freedom to disagree with me." She waited. "You've built something here," he said. "In 2 months. You've made this office run in a way it never did. You've helped bring down a man who has been a source of serious harm in this community for years. You've made a friend in Charlotte. People respect you." He paused. "I respect you. More than I can easily say." "Kane," she said. "And I want—" He stopped. He turned to look at her, and there was nothing calculated in his expression, nothing performed, just the plain and vulnerable reality of someone saying a true thing. "I would like you to stay. Not because Caldwell needs a telegraph operator, though it does. Because Kane," she said again, softer. "I am trying," he said, "to be articulate about something I am not particularly articulate about." She looked at the enormous sky, and then at the man beside her, and she thought about Boston and Cincinnati and the train platform in April with her leather trunk and her carpet bag, and the composure that had taken years to assemble. She thought about the first conversation in the telegraph office when she had told him what she had seen, and he had listened with complete seriousness, and then thanked her. She thought about the 4 words in the silver dollar that were still, even now, resonating. "I already decided to stay," she said. He looked at her. "I wrote to the Western Union Regional Office in May," she said. "I requested a permanent posting." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You didn't tell me." "I was waiting," she said, "to see if you would say it. What you're trying to say right now." He looked at her, and the thing she had noticed first in his expression, that quality of quiet, careful calculation, was entirely gone. What was left was open and warm and very direct. "I am in love with you," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say." The sky above them was beginning to shade toward gold at the western edge, the long Kansas summer evening stretching out, the light doing what it did in that part of the country, dramatic and honest, no subtlety in it, everything laid clear. "I know," she said. "I have been for some time as well." He took her hand, not dramatically, just her hand in his, warm and certain, and they stood there for a while in the golden light with the enormous sky above them and the ordinary sounds of Caldwell all around them. She turned to face him, and he was already looking at her, and she lifted up slightly onto her toes and kissed him, unhurriedly, the way that things are done when they are finally allowed to happen after a long and careful approach. He kissed her back with the same unhurried certainty, one hand coming up to her face with a gentleness that made her understand, suddenly and completely, everything she needed to understand about what kind of man he was. The summer deepened. She was extraordinarily busy. The cattle drives of 1882 were significant, and the volume of communication through the Caldwell telegraph office was constant and demanding. She expanded the office's hours, trained a part-time assistant, a young man named Henry who was 16, and had a natural aptitude that she recognized and cultivated with the same energy her mother had cultivated hers, and maintained the meticulous record-keeping that had already become the office's hallmark. She was also, in the remaining hours of her days, deeply occupied with being in love, which she had not done before, not like this, and which took more of her attention and energy than she had anticipated, but in a way that added to her life rather than depleting it. Kane courted her with the same straightforward care he brought to everything he did. Dinner at the restaurant on 3rd Street, which had tablecloths and imported coffee from Mexico, and a cook who had come from New Orleans and had opinions about everything. Walks in the evenings. Sunday afternoons, her free day, which they began to spend with increasing regularity together. Sometimes simply sitting in the pleasant silence of 2 people who found each other's company intrinsically restful. He brought her books from the small lending library that operated out of the back of the furniture store, having apparently made a study of her tastes from what she mentioned. He remembered things she told him, details, opinions, passing references, with an attentiveness that moved her more than grand gestures would have, because it told her something specific about the quality of his regard. There was, in all of it, a tenderness that she had not entirely expected. She had formed, over the years, a working theory of what men were like, and Kane Daltrey kept revising it in directions that she found compelling. He was also, she discovered, funny. Not in the broad performing way, but with a dry wit that appeared in unexpected moments and delighted her every time. He could tell a story about a deputy's mishap or a town council meeting that had gone sideways, with such precise comic timing that she lost all composure, laughing until her sides hurt, in a way she could not remember doing since before her mother died. Charlotte observed all of this with great satisfaction. "I will say," Charlotte told her in July, "that for a pair of people taking it slowly, you seem to be covering ground." "We are being sensible," Beatrice said, and smiled. "The sensible ones always fall the hardest," Charlotte said sagely. "Ask me how I know." In August, Gerald Finch came back to Caldwell. Not with any menace. His arrest, it turned out, had been preventable if Kane had sufficient evidence, but the evidence had been thin enough that Finch had walked away from the whole matter with nothing worse than disgrace. He was a diminished figure, the careful pallor of anxiety replaced by something flatter, the look of a man who understood what he had been and found it difficult to look at directly. He came to the telegraph office one morning and stood in the doorway. Beatrice looked at him. "I want to apologize," he said. She waited. "The letters," he said. "Charlotte's letters. I told myself it was not my business, that the arrangement I had with Harlan was a matter of commerce, not of harm." He paused. "I understand now that it was both." "Yes," she said. "I am sorry," he said, "for what was done here, for what I permitted." She looked at him for a long moment. He was a man who had made accommodations that had cost someone else very dearly, and he knew it, and the knowledge had clearly settled on him in a way that would not easily lift. She thought about what forgiveness meant, not the kind that erased accountability, but the kind that allowed both parties to move through it and forward. "I accept your apology," she said. "Charlotte should receive the same if you're willing." "I intend to give it," he said. He left. She watched him go, and then went back to her transmissions, and thought about Gerald Finch and Harlan Voss, and the particular ways that human cowardice and human cruelty sometimes wore each other's clothing, and how difficult it could be to tell them apart until the damage was already done. Charlotte did receive Finch's apology. She received it standing in the doorway of the boarding house with her arms folded and her chin lifted, and she accepted it with the particular dignity of a woman who has been through something hard and come out the other side knowing her own worth. "He looked terrible," Charlotte told Beatrice afterward. "Yes," Beatrice said. "Good," Charlotte said simply, and picked up her sewing. Harlan Voss's trial in Wichita came in September. Beatrice was called as a witness to testify about the communications she had identified as fraudulent. She took the witness stand in the Wichita courthouse, wearing her best gray dress, and spoke with the precision and confidence of someone who is absolutely certain of the facts in evidence. And the defense attorney, who had attempted to shake her testimony with the usual techniques, had found her completely unshakable. Kane sat in the gallery for the 2 days she testified, and she had been aware of him there in the peripheral way that you are aware of a fixed point, not distracting, just present. Harlan Voss was convicted of cattle theft, fraud, and assault. He received a sentence of 12 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary. Charlotte, in the gallery, sat very still when the verdict was read and then exhaled, slowly and completely, like a person setting down something very heavy. Afterward, on the steps of the courthouse, Kane found Beatrice and said nothing for a moment, just stood beside her in the September sun and then said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. And then, because she was honest, "I'm relieved," which I knew I would be. "But it feels different than I imagined." "It usually does," he said. "Justice is rarely satisfying in the way you hope. It's just correct, and correct is worth something." "Yes," she said, "it is." They traveled back to Caldwell on the train. The journey took several hours, and they sat together in the passenger car as the Kansas landscape moved past them, flat and vast and strange and beautiful in its specific way, the sky doing its dramatic work at every hour, and talked and read and were sometimes simply quiet, which was the most comfortable kind of journey there was. She looked at him at one point, across the width between their seats, his face turned toward the window and the moving light, and felt something that she did not immediately have a word for. Not just love, though it was that. Something more complete than love as she had understood it. A sense of being known, and of being glad to be known. She did not say this. She stored it in the way that she stored things carefully in a place she could return to. October arrived. Beatrice watched her and thought about freedom and what it cost and what it gave back. She also noticed, that evening, that Kane was quieter than usual. Not troubled, she knew his troubled quiet, and this was different. This was the quiet of someone working up to something. They were walking back through town afterward, the October air carrying its first real edge of cold, the nights drawing in, the cattle pens quieter as the driving season wound toward its end. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes," she said. He stopped. She stopped. They were standing on 2nd Street between the hardware store and the land office, neither of which was interesting, but the light from the nearest building fell warm across the sidewalk, and the stars were out above them in force. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to understand that there is no pressure in this question. Whatever your answer is, I will accept it, and nothing will change between us that I don't want to change." She looked at him steadily. Her heart had taken on its changed tempo again. "I want to ask you," he said, "if you would consider marrying me." The stars continued their business above them. The hardware store remained what it was. She looked at him for a long moment, not hesitating, but savoring in the way that you might savor the last few seconds before something wonderful begins, holding it in awareness so you can carry the memory of it forward. "Yes," she said, "I would consider it." He laughed, a genuine, slightly startled laugh, and she realized he had been more nervous than he showed. "You would consider it," he repeated. "I would do it," she corrected herself and smiled. "I would very much like to marry you." He reached into his coat pocket, and the ring he produced was small and plain. A thin gold band with a single garnet, dark red, the color of depth rather than flash. He put it on her hand, and it fit, which she would learn was not accident, that he had asked Charlotte for her help measuring it in a subterfuge she was enormously pleased about. She looked at the ring on her hand and then at his face, and she said, "It's perfect." "Charlotte told me the garnet," he said. "I just found the band." "I will have to thank her," Beatrice said. "She's going to be insufferable about it," Kane said. "She absolutely is," Beatrice agreed. He kissed her, there on 2nd Street in the October cold with the stars doing their work overhead, and she put both her hands against his chest and kissed him back, and it was perfect and real and nothing at all like the book she had read when she was young, which was exactly what made it better. Charlotte was insufferable about it. Magnificently, joyfully, completely insufferable, and Beatrice loved every moment. The wedding was set for January. In the weeks between October and January, Caldwell settled into its winter rhythm, the cattle pens empty, the trail quiet, the town smaller in its winter dress. The telegraph office continued its work, though the volume of communication had dropped with the end of the driving season, and Beatrice used the quieter hours to expand the training she was giving Henry, who had turned out to have an exceptional aptitude that she was genuinely excited about. Kane proposed in those months that she move into a proper house rather than the boarding house, and she proposed in return that they find the house together, which they did. A 2-story wooden house on the west side of town, solidly built by a German family who had moved on to better prospects in Colorado, with a kitchen that had good light and a front porch that faced west and a second floor with enough rooms to be genuinely practical. She moved her things from the boarding house in December, and he moved his things from the room above the sheriff's office where he had been living for 2 years, and the house became something that neither of them had organized by themselves. It became theirs, which is a different category entirely. She put her telegraph training books on the shelf in the study. He put his law volumes on the same shelf. They looked correct together. The wedding took place on the 3rd Saturday in January 1883. It was conducted by Pastor Harrington, who had sheltered her on the night of Harlan Voss's confrontation, and who now beamed through the whole ceremony with the particular satisfaction of a man who felt he had a personal stake in the outcome, at the small white church on Maple Street. Charlotte stood beside Beatrice. Sam Pryor stood beside Kane. The congregation was small and genuine, the people who had become, over the months, real to both of them. The network of trust and familiarity and shared history that was the actual substance of belonging somewhere. When Pastor Harrington said, "You may kiss your wife," Kane looked at her first, just for a second, the way he looked at her in the moments before he said something that mattered. And she saw in his face everything she needed to see. And then he kissed her with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything that was important to him. And she kissed him back, and the small congregation was warmly demonstrative about it. Charlotte wept, beautifully, with complete dignity. Sam Pryor made a speech at the dinner afterward that was earnest and somewhat repetitive and entirely from the heart, and everyone was very moved by it. The night was cold and clear, the January stars crystalline above Kansas, and they walked home through the dark town, her hand in his, to the house that was theirs. Spring of 1883 arrived in Caldwell with its usual suddenness, winter releasing its grip overnight. It seemed, the world going from gray to green between one Monday and the next. The cattle drives would begin again. The town would swell with the seasonal population. The telegraph office would enter its busy season. Beatrice found, that spring, that she had something she had not had in the previous spring: continuity. The sense of a future that was genuinely hers in this particular place, rooted, real. She walked the familiar streets and knew their names and the names of the people in them, and they knew hers. Not the careful, provisional knowledge of a new arrival, but the comfortable knowledge of someone who lived somewhere and meant to keep doing so. She also found, in the spring, that she was expecting a child. She told Kane on a Tuesday evening in April, sitting at the kitchen table with the last of the winter's coffee, which neither of them had gotten around to replacing. He was quiet for a long moment. Not a worrying quiet, she knew his quiets. This was the kind that meant he was feeling something too large for immediate expression. "A child," he said. "In October, I think," she said. "Maybe late September. Dr. Garrett is not entirely certain yet." He looked at her, and what was in his face was so open and genuine and overwhelmed in the best possible way that she felt it like warmth, like sun on her back, like a fire on a cold evening, something that reached all the way in. "Beatrice," he said, and could not seem to get further than her name. "I know," she said, and reached across the table and took his hand. He brought her hand to his mouth, and pressed his lips against her knuckles with a tenderness that bypassed every defense she still, habitually, maintained. And she sat in the warm kitchen in the spring evening and was very happy. Charlotte, who was still in Caldwell, she had stayed through the winter, finding that she preferred it, finding that she had friends and a place and a future of her own that she was still assembling piece by piece, was the first person they told. She sat in the kitchen with them and looked between them and then said, with complete simplicity, "I am so glad." And she was. Beatrice could see it clearly. The genuine gladness of a woman who had come through something very dark and had arrived in a place where she could sit in someone else's kitchen and feel joy on their behalf. It was one of the most meaningful things she had witnessed in Caldwell, which had given her many meaningful things to witness. The summer was full. The telegraph office was at its seasonal peak, which meant long days and the constant demands of a major communication hub in a cattle town at the height of the driving season. Beatrice worked as long as she could manage and then handed more responsibility to Henry, who was ready for it and received it with the serious competence she had anticipated. Kane was also busy. The busy season of cattle driving was also the busy season of cattle town law enforcement, and there were nights he came home late and tired with the specific tiredness of a man who has been mediating other people's worst impulses all day. But he came home. That was the thing she found she would not take for granted. There were smaller difficulties in those months. A dispute between a local rancher and a Texas drover that had to be carefully managed. A traveling con man who had set up a card game at the Silver Dollar with mathematics that did not belong to chance, and who had to be encouraged, firmly, by Kane personally, to pursue his career elsewhere. A minor flood in June that damaged 3 buildings on 3rd Street and required the entire town to engage in the particular organized communal effort that Beatrice had not seen in Boston or Cincinnati, but that she found here strangely moving. Everyone who could lift things, lifting things. Everyone who could cook, cooking. A disaster managed by community, which was the only reliable way disasters got managed. She organized the communication during the flood, keeping lines open, getting messages to and from the county seat about resources, coordinating information with the efficiency that was her genuine gift. Kane organized the physical effort. They worked in parallel, as they did many things, with the ease of people who had learned each other's methods and trusted them completely. In the evenings in those months, they would sit on the west-facing porch and watch the Kansas sunsets, which were not subtle and had never pretended to be. The sky went through its full range: orange, red, purple, a blue so deep it was almost black before the stars came through, and she would lean against him, her head on his shoulder, and they would talk or not talk, and the days settled into the evenings and the evenings into the nights with a peace she had never expected to find, least of all here. She had been told she did not belong. She thought about that sometimes in those evening hours. Not with bitterness. The bitterness had never fully taken hold. She was too practical for bitterness. But with the particular retrospective clarity of someone who can see the whole shape of something from a distance. She had been told she did not belong, and she had not believed it, and she had been right not to believe it, and the rightness of that decision had given her this: the porch, the sunset, the man beside her, the child growing, the work she was genuinely proud of, the friends who were genuine, the community that had come to be real. She thought about her mother, who had told her that competence was the most important thing a person could carry. She was beginning to think her mother had been correct, but incomplete. Competence was necessary. But belonging, the earned, real, specific belonging she had found here, was also important. Perhaps equally. October arrived. The child arrived with it, a boy, born on the 16th, which Dr. Garrett had not predicted but which turned out to be exactly right, as unexpected things sometimes were. A boy, with his father's dark hair and his mother's focused eyes, loud in the specific way that meant his lungs were excellent, present and complete, and entirely himself. They named him Thomas Samuel Daltrey, Thomas for Kane's father, Samuel for Sam Pryor, who was moved enough by the honor that he cried briefly, and then looked extremely dignified about it. Charlotte came to the house the day after, with a casserole she had made and a small knitted blanket in soft blue wool, and she stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at Beatrice and Thomas with the expression of someone who has seen something they will keep forever in their interior collection of beautiful things. "He's perfect," she said. "He's very loud," Beatrice said. "That's how you know he's healthy," Charlotte said. "So everyone keeps telling me," Beatrice said, and looked down at the small, fierce face of her son with an astonishment that she suspected was not going to wear off any time soon. Kane came in and stood beside the bed, and he looked at Thomas with the expression he had been wearing for 20 hours now. Struck, completely struck, the expression of a man in whom something enormous has happened, and who is still understanding the full dimensions of it. He reached out and Thomas wrapped one small hand around his finger with the automatic grip of a brand new person asserting himself upon the world. "Hello," Kane said softly, to his son, as if they were being introduced, which in the most real sense they were. Beatrice watched them and felt something complete. Winter of 1883 and 1884 was the most domestic season of her life, which was a new category of experience. The telegraph office was quieter. Thomas was very much present. Kane had hired a second full-time deputy, a capable man named Webb Laird who had come from Missouri and had the steady practical intelligence that good law enforcement required, which gave him somewhat more reasonable hours. They were, in that winter, more than anything else, ordinary. Magnificently, specifically, consciously ordinary. The kind of people who had found the life they wanted and were living in it with full attention. She went back to the telegraph office in January, bringing Thomas with her in the hours when he would sleep in the basket she positioned near her station, the rhythm of the Morse key apparently pleasing to him in some fundamental sonic way. Henry managed the other hours with complete competence. She expanded his role formally, writing to the Western Union regional office to have him properly compensated and credentialed. Charlotte, in the spring of 1884, told Beatrice that she was leaving Caldwell. Beatrice had known it was coming. Charlotte had been increasingly quiet about a particular direction, the way that people were quiet about things they were still deciding. She had received a letter from a cousin in Colorado who ran a small hotel, and the letter had prompted something in her, a readiness that had been building all winter. "Colorado," Charlotte said. "Pueblo. My cousin needs someone who is competent and organized and willing to work hard." "That describes you precisely," Beatrice said. Charlotte smiled. "I think it's time. I think I've been here healing, if I'm honest. And now I think I'm healed enough to go build something for myself." Beatrice looked at her, at the woman who had arrived at the boarding house in April 1882, with bruises old enough to have yellowed at the edges, and a false name, and the particular caution of someone who had been afraid for a very long time, and who was now sitting across from her with clear eyes and a direct gaze, and the unmistakable bearing of someone who knew her own worth. "I'm proud of you," Beatrice said. "It was simple and true." "Don't make me cry in public," Charlotte said, which meant she was already very close to it. They said their goodbyes on the Caldwell train platform in late May, which was the same platform where Beatrice had arrived with her leather trunk and her carpet bag, and her assembled composure, 14 months earlier. Thomas was on Beatrice's hip, looking at the train with the comprehensive fascination of a small child confronting something large and loud and magnificent. Charlotte kissed Thomas's forehead. She embraced Beatrice with the full strength of real feeling. She shook Kane's hand and then, because she had known him for a year and a half and life was short and sentimentality could be dignified, she embraced him too. "Take care of her," Charlotte said into his shoulder. "She takes care of herself," he said. "I'm mainly here for company." Charlotte pulled back and looked at him with laughing eyes. "Yes," she said. "Exactly right." The train took her. Beatrice watched it go until the smoke was just a smudge against the blue May sky, and then she shifted Thomas more securely on her hip and turned back toward town. Kane fell into step beside her. They walked the familiar streets in the late spring morning, Thomas making his various observations about the world in the language of small children, which is comprehensive and entirely confident in its authority, even when completely unintelligible. "Are you all right?" Kane asked. "Yes," she said, and then, "I will miss her." "So will I," he said. He had, she reflected, been perfectly kind to Charlotte for the entirety of the time she had been in Caldwell, which was not a small thing. It would have been easy not to be. Charlotte's situation had been complicated, her history difficult, her presence in the town the result of a crisis rather than a choice. Kane had treated her with the same straightforward, decent regard he extended to everyone who deserved it, which had mattered to Charlotte very much. "Write to her," he said. "She'll write back." "I intend to," Beatrice said. The correspondence with Charlotte turned out to be one of the ongoing pleasures of Beatrice's life. Charlotte's letters from Pueblo were vivid and funny and increasingly optimistic. The hotel was a success. The cousin was excellent company. Charlotte had made friends with the woman who ran the millinery next door and had opinions about the new mayor that she expressed with considerable force. She was, Beatrice could see in every letter, genuinely building something, genuinely free, genuinely herself. The years moved. The telegraph office in Caldwell expanded as communication generally expanded in those years, the wire carrying more and more of the country's business and feeling. Henry became, by 1885, the assistant manager, in fact if not yet in title, and Beatrice made the argument to Western Union for the title and won it, because she had learned over the years to argue with an institution's own logic, and that this was the most efficient way to change what needed changing. Caldwell itself changed. The cattle-driving era was already beginning its long shift, the economics and the politics of the land both moving in directions that would eventually close the great trails and end the particular era that had given the town its character. Beatrice watched this with the interest of someone who understood that endings were also beginnings. The cattle town would become something else, was already becoming something else, and the something else would have its own character and its own needs. Kane thought about this too. She knew because they talked about it. The way they talked about everything that mattered, on the west porch in the evenings, or in the kitchen over coffee, or in the easy, companionable way of a long walk where conversation paused and resumed without losing its thread. He was 35 in 1886, and she was 30, and they had been married for 3 years, and Thomas was nearly 3 years old and had developed a comprehensive set of opinions about the world and particularly about horses, which he regarded with the same passionate admiration his father did, but had not yet been granted the opportunity to pursue at the same scale. In the summer of 1886, she discovered she was expecting again. June or July, Dr. Garrett told her in December, with the increased precision of a man who had been doing this for 40 years and had sharpened his estimates accordingly. June, as it turned out. A girl this time, born on a warm evening in late June when the light outside the window was precisely the color of the sunsets they watched from the porch. A girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, which was a combination that was going to cause considerable comment throughout her life, Beatrice suspected, and which she found immediately and completely beautiful. They named her Eleanor Jane Daltrey. Eleanor because Beatrice had loved the name since childhood. Jane for Charlotte Voss, now Charlotte Fenwick of Pueblo, Colorado, who received the letter with this information and wrote back a response of such genuine emotion that Beatrice read it 3 times. Thomas, who was by now very nearly 3.5 and had firm positions on most things, examined his sister with the serious intensity of a small scientist confronting a significant data point, and then declared her small with an authority that suggested he considered this a factual observation rather than a judgment. "She will grow," Beatrice told him. "When?" Thomas asked. "Continuously," Kane said with perfect seriousness, and Thomas considered this for a moment and then accepted it and moved on to his next concern, which was whether there would be biscuits at dinner. The house was fuller, louder. The west porch saw more traffic. Thomas with his constant energy and his questions. Eleanor in Kane's arms watching the sunsets with an attention that seemed remarkable for a small baby, but which Beatrice chose to interpret as genuine aesthetic appreciation. She had not, in any of this, stopped being the person she was. She was still the telegraph operator, still precise, still fast, still the person who organized information the way a river organized water. She was still the person who read Frederick Olmsted and had opinions. She was still the person who had walked into a saloon gunfight when told to stay in a church, who had pulled herself free of Harlan Voss's grip with a technique she had learned in Boston and applied in Kansas, who had built something real in a place she had been told was not hers. She was also, fully and without conflict, a mother and a wife in the specific way that meant those things added to who she was rather than replacing it. And she was, still, fiercely and precisely happy. One evening in the autumn of 1886, Thomas was asleep, and Eleanor was nearly asleep in the cradle they had moved to the sitting room, and Beatrice and Kane were on the west porch with the remains of the season's warmth still in the October air. The stars were out. The Kansas sky, vast and absolute, was doing what it always did, making everything feel both very small and very significant simultaneously. "You know," Kane said after a long companionable silence, "I think about that night sometimes. In the Silver Dollar." She glanced at him. "So do I." "I was terrified," he said. "I don't say that to seem brave about it retroactively. I was genuinely, completely frightened." "For yourself?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "For you," he said. "Only for you." "I looked at you and there was a gun at your head and he paused, searching for precision. "I understood something in that moment, very clearly. What I would be without you. I hadn't admitted it to myself until then, but the possibility of losing you made it completely obvious." She was quiet for a moment. "I pulled myself free," she said, "partly because I was scared and partly because of what you said." "What I said?" "You belong right here," she said. "In the middle of all of that, the gun and the room and the crowd and everything, you said that, and I believed you. And I thought, if he believes that, then I have to get out of this on my own terms, because there are things I intend to do." He turned to look at her. The starlight was not bright enough to read expressions by, but she knew his face well enough by now that she did not need the light. "What things?" He said, "This," she said simply. "All of it. Everything that came after." He reached across and took her hand the way he had on that October night 2 years ago on 2nd Street, and the ring on her hand was the same one, the garnet, dark red in the starlight, warm against her skin. "Beatrice," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am going to spend a very long time being grateful," he said. "So am I," she said. Inside, Alina made a small sound and then was quiet again. Thomas was deeply, completely asleep, as only small children were, total and absolute surrender to rest. The house stood solid and warm behind them. The town was out there in the dark, its familiar sounds and shapes, the things she had built herself into and which had, in turn, built something into her. She had been told she did not belong. She looked at the stars and at the man beside her, and at the lamplight falling from the window of her house onto the porch boards, and she felt the weight and the warmth of all of it. The belonging that she had not been given but had claimed, the life that had not been handed to her but assembled, piece by patient piece, out of work and courage and the willingness to walk into a saloon gunfight when everything in her chest was telling her to run the other way. The belonging that had been confirmed in a moment of crisis by a man who had looked at her across a room full of danger and said 4 words that were, when stripped of everything else, just the truth. She was right here. She had always been right here, and she was not going anywhere. The Kansas night continued its enormous, indifferent, beautiful work above them. The stars moved their infinitesimal distance. The wind that came off the plains was cold with the promise of winter and the faint residual warmth of autumn. The 2 seasons negotiating the transition in the way that seasons did, not cleanly, not all at once, but gradually and then completely. Beatrice leaned her head against Kane's shoulder and felt the solid, certain warmth of him, and listened to the last sounds of Caldwell settling into its night. And she thought that this was what it meant to belong somewhere. Not the absence of difficulty, not the approval of strangers, not being told by the right people that you were welcome. It was this, the specific weight of a life you had built in a specific place with specific people, the accumulated reality of seasons and conversations and dinners and crises and ordinary evenings, all of it adding up to something that was unmistakably, completely, irreversibly yours. She had been told she did not belong in the West. She had decided, early and decisively, to disagree. And the West, this corner of it, this particular town under this particular sky, had in its own time and its own way agreed with her.